There is a question that has lived in the chest of every human being who has ever drawn breath. It surfaces in the early morning hours when the rest of the world is still asleep. It shows up in the middle of success, whispering that something still seems to be missing. It rises in quiet moments between the noise and the busyness that we use to keep ourselves distracted from it. The question is this: is there more? Not more money, not more recognition, not more years, though those things matter too. The question runs deeper than any of that. It is asking whether the life you are living right now is the life you were made for. It is asking whether there is a specific, irreplaceable purpose attached to your name, a reason you were born into this particular body, in this particular time, facing the particular circumstances that sit before you. The answer, unambiguously, is yes. You were not an accident. You were not a coincidence. You were not simply the outcome of a series of biological events. You were designed, deliberately, carefully, and with extraordinary attention to detail. And if that is true, then it follows that your Creator had something in mind when He designed you.
But here is where so many people get stuck. They believe that God has a plan, at least in the abstract. They believe it during a Sunday sermon or when they read it printed on a card. But the living out of that belief, the actual daily practical manifestation of God's will in their lives, that is where the faith begins to feel thin. That is where belief in the concept fails to translate into lived experience. This audiobook is about that gap. It is about the space between knowing that God has a purpose for you and actually walking in it. It is about the specific, real human work involved in aligning yourself with what you were made for. It is not a theological dissertation. It is not a list of steps or a self-help formula. It is a conversation, one that takes seriously both the spiritual and the deeply human dimensions of what it means to live on purpose. We are going to talk about identity, about stillness, about the courage it...
Before we begin, I want to say something that I hope stays with you long after you finish this. The will of God for your life is not a locked door that you have to find the right key to open. It is not hidden from you by a God who is testing whether you are clever enough to figure it out. The will of God is something you were built to sense, to feel, to recognize. And most of the time, the work is not in discovering it. The work is in removing the things that are blocking your view of what was always already there. That is what we are going to do together. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Understanding the will of God. What are we actually talking about? Before we can manifest anything, we have to understand what we are trying to manifest. And the phrase, the will of God, is one of those phrases that religious culture has used so many times in so many contexts that it can start to feel vague, like a spiritual placeholder we say when we do not know what else to say. So let us be specific.
When we talk about the will of God for your life, we are talking about a few distinct things, and it helps to separate them. There is what we might call the universal will of God, the things He desires for all people, everywhere. Love, justice, mercy, wholeness. These are not specific to you. They apply to the entire human family. Then there is the specific will of God, the particular calling, assignment, and purpose attached to your life and no one else's. And then there is the moment-by-moment will of God, the guidance available to you in each decision, each turning point, each unexpected disruption of your plans. All three of these matter. But when people ask the deep question, when they lie awake wondering what their life is really for, they are usually asking about the specific will. They want to know, what was I made to do? What is my assignment? What is the thing that, if I spend my life doing it, will mean that my years had weight and meaning? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11.
That passage from Jeremiah is one of the most quoted verses in the Bible,
And there is a reason for that. It addresses something foundational to the human experience, the need to know that there is a plan, that we are held, that the future is not simply chaos into which we fall. But notice what the verse does not say. It does not say the plan will be effortless. It does not say it will unfold automatically. It says the plans exist, and that they are plans of hope and a future. The plans exist, but you still have to walk them out. God's will is not a puzzle to be solved. One of the greatest misconceptions about the will of God is that it is a mystery that must be cracked, a secret code that God has buried and which you have to be spiritual enough to decode. This misunderstanding causes enormous damage. It keeps people paralyzed, waiting for a sign so undeniably clear that they could not possibly misinterpret it. It makes people feel like spiritual failures when they cannot hear a specific booming directive from the sky. The truth is quieter and more intimate than that. Think about it this way. If you were a craftsman and you built a chair, the chair would not need a special revelation to understand its purpose. Its purpose is embedded in its design. The curve of the back, the height of the legs, the strength of the joints, everything about it points to what it was made for. The design is the message. You are more than a chair, but the principle holds. Your design contains your purpose, your deepest longings, not the shallow ones that come and go, but the persistent ones that refuse to die no matter how many times life tries to bury them. Those longings are not random. They are signals. They are data. They are part of how your Creator communicates with you about who you are and what you are here for. The will of God for your life is not primarily found through agonizing, striving, and searching. It is primarily found through paying attention, through learning to read the language of your own soul, which is speaking to you constantly in the currency of desire, restlessness, passion, and grief.
The difference between the will of God and your comfort zone. Here is something that trips up a lot of people. They assume that if something is the will of God, it will feel natural and easy. They assume alignment means the absence of friction. And so when they move toward what they believe they are called to and encounter fear, resistance, or struggle, they interpret that as a sign that they must be wrong, that this is not really the path. Nothing could be further from the truth. The will of God will almost certainly require you to grow beyond the person you currently are. It will ask things of you that you do not yet know how to give. It will place you in situations where your current abilities are insufficient and where you will have to lean on something beyond your own capacity. That is not a malfunction. That is the design. God is not looking to work through the person you are today, frozen in place. He is working to grow you into the person the purpose requires. This is why so many people who are right on the edge of their purpose turn back. The moment it gets hard, the moment the fear arrives, the moment the outcome is uncertain, they conclude that this cannot be God's will because it does not feel safe. But purpose almost never feels safe, at least not in the beginning. It feels like standing at the edge of something vast, knowing you have to jump, and not being entirely certain the landing will be as soft as you hope. Faith is the willingness to jump anyway. Chapter 2. The Inner Work. Becoming who you were made to be. The work before the work. There is a conversation that happens in almost every area of excellence. In sports, in art, in business, in craft. It is the conversation about the preparation that happens before the performance. The years of practice before the stage. The pre-dawn hours of training before the competition. The thousands of drafts before the published masterpiece. The spiritual life is no different. Before you can step into the full expression of what you were made for, there is inner work to be done. This is not punitive. God is not making you earn your way to purpose. The inner work is necessary because the person you will need to be in order to carry the assignment
requires a development that the assignment itself will demand. You cannot fully give what you do not yet fully have. And the inner work, the real inner work, almost always begins with the same question. Who do you believe you are? Identity, the foundation of everything. Before a single practical step can be taken toward manifesting God's will in your life, before any prayer is prayed, or any door is knocked, or any risk is taken, there is an identity question that must be answered. And it cannot be answered intellectually. It has to be answered in the place where you live, in the quiet, private interior where the real you decides what is possible. The question is this: do you believe that you are someone God would actually choose to use?
Not someone impressive enough, not someone holy enough, not someone talented enough, or educated enough, or experienced enough. Just someone he would choose, someone he looks at and says, yes, you. I made you for this. Most people, when they honestly examine what they believe about themselves in that private place, find that the answer is more complicated than they would like to admit. There are layers of old messages, things said by people who were supposed to know, things concluded in the aftermath of failures, things absorbed from environments that had no interest in telling you the truth about your worth. And underneath those layers, there is often a quiet, persistent whisper that says, not you. Maybe for other people, not for you. That whisper is a lie. But it is a lie that has been there a long time, and it does not leave because someone tells you to think positive. It leaves through a different process. The process of allowing truth to work its way into the deep interior, slowly, patiently, layer by layer. A word about your past. One of the enemy's favorite strategies is to use your history as evidence against your future. But God has always been in the business of using people whose histories do not read like endorsements. He used a man who murdered an Egyptian and fled the country, and then 40 years later called him to lead a nation. He used a shepherd boy who had never fought a soldier in his life to face a giant that had terrified trained armies. He used a fisherman who denied knowing his closest friend 3 times in a single night to build a church that would outlast empires. Your past is not your disqualification. Sometimes it is precisely your past that equips you to carry the specific assignment your life is pointing toward. The wound often becomes the gift. The place of your deepest brokenness, when brought into the hands of God, frequently becomes the place of your most powerful ministry. This does not mean the past did not happen. It means the past does not have the last word. Clearing the clutter. If identity is the foundation of manifesting God's will, then the work of clearing is what makes room for the foundation to be laid properly. Because most of us are carrying things we were never meant to carry. Offenses we have held so long they have become part of our identity. Fears that were installed by someone else's voice and are now running quietly in the background of everything we do. Commitments to mediocrity that were made in the aftermath of a defeat and were supposed to be temporary but became permanent. Forgiveness is part of this clearing, not for the benefit of the person who hurt you, for the benefit of you. Unforgiveness is like carrying someone on your back, dragging them with you everywhere you go, into every room, every opportunity, every relationship. It costs you enormous energy that is needed for the work of becoming. The moment you set that weight down is not a moment of moral weakness. It is a moment of strategic intelligence. You are choosing your future over your grievance. Fear is another form of clutter. And the particular fear that most often blocks the manifestation of God's will is not fear of failure. It is fear of visibility. Fear of what happens if you actually step into the fullness of who you were made to be and people see you there. Fear that if you fully emerge, fully show up, fully commit to the life you were made for, the scrutiny will be unbearable,
The criticism will be devastating. The exposure will cost you more than it is worth. But here is the truth about fear. It is not the opposite of faith. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward in spite of it. Every person who has ever stepped into the fullness of their purpose did so while afraid. The fear was there. They went anyway. The difference between people who live in purpose and people who don't is rarely about talent or anointing. It is almost always about the willingness to act in the presence of fear.
Chapter 3. The Power of Agreement. You were not made to figure this out alone. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with trying to carry a purpose that feels too big for you. You can see it, the vision of what you are meant to do, the life you are meant to live, but it sits at a distance, and you are standing where you are, with what you have, in the circumstances you are in. And the gap between here and there can feel impossibly wide. One of the great mistakes that people make in the pursuit of purpose is attempting to make the journey entirely alone, as though faith is a private, solitary transaction between a person and God that does not require community, relationship, or the voice of other people. This is not how the architecture of purpose works. You need people who can see in you what you cannot yet see in yourself. You need people who are further along the road, who can tell you what is ahead. You need people who will tell you the truth, not to wound you, but because love that only flatters you is not actually serving your growth. And you need people who will pray with you, stand with you, and refuse to let
Agreement with God. But before agreement with people, there is something more fundamental: agreement with God. This might seem obvious. Of course, if you are trying to manifest God's will, you agree with God. But agreement is not just a theological position. It is a lived posture. It is what happens when the way you think about yourself, the way you talk about your situation, the way you respond to obstacles, and the things you reach for in moments of difficulty all align with what God has said about you and about the nature of reality. Most of us agree with God on Sunday and disagree with Him on Monday. We agree with Him in prayer and then speak in direct contradiction to that prayer as soon as the circumstance in front of us looks impossible. We declare His promises in the sanctuary and then recite our limitations the moment someone asks us about our potential. Agreement with God means choosing, in the practical, moment-by-moment unfolding of your daily life, to act as though what He says is true, to speak as though it is true, to make decisions as though it is true. Not because you have no doubts, not because the evidence always supports it, but because you have decided, as an act of the will, not as a feeling, that His word carries more weight than the current evidence. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. This is not positive thinking in the shallow, commercial sense. This is the recognition that your thought life is not neutral. What you believe, at the level where the real decisions are made, determines what you reach for and what you walk past. It determines what you see as an opportunity and what you see as an obstacle. It shapes, over time, the very contours of your life. And so aligning your thought life with the truth of who God says you are is not optional spiritual maintenance. It is the work of clearing the ground so that what is planted can actually grow. The spoken word. There is a dimension of agreement that deserves its own attention, because it is one that is often overlooked in sophisticated circles. The things you say out loud, consistently, as a practice, matter. Not in a magical sense, not as though repeating phrases creates reality by formula, but in the sense that language is not merely the expression of what you already believe. Language shapes belief. The things you say regularly, you begin to internalize. The narrative. Pay attention for 1 week to the things you say habitually about yourself and your situation. Notice the phrases that come out automatically. Notice the things you say with a laugh that are actually quite serious. Notice the limitations you announce casually, as though they are simply facts and not chosen stories. Many people are in the practice of rehearsing their limitations, their fears, not because they want to, but because it has become the default voice. And the default voice went unchallenged for so long that it began to feel true. Changing the story you tell about your life is not dishonesty. It is not pretending that the difficulty is not real. It is choosing to place the difficulty inside a larger frame, a frame that includes the God who has not abandoned you, the purpose that has not been canceled, and the future that has not been foreclosed. Chapter 4: Silence, Stillness, and the Voice Within. The Noise Problem. We live in a world that has an unprecedented ability to fill every available moment with sound, image, notification, and distraction. This is not an accident. There are entire industries built on the business model of capturing and holding your attention, of ensuring that the moment you begin to feel quiet, something arrives to pull you back into stimulation. For the person who is trying to discern the will of God, this is a serious problem. Because the will of God, in its most intimate and personal expressions, does not usually arrive as a thunderclap. It does not typically interrupt your scrolling. It is quiet. It is consistent. It speaks in a register that requires stillness to hear, in the way that certain instruments in an orchestra can only be heard when the louder ones fall silent. One of the most countercultural and spiritually necessary things you can do in the pursuit of purpose is to regularly, intentionally, deliberately choose silence. Not the absence of obligation, which almost no one can create, but the presence of stillness, the practice of turning off the noise, sitting with yourself, and making room for whatever is true to rise to the surface. What happens in the silence? Most people are afraid of silence, and that fear is instructive. When the noise goes away and the stillness arrives, what tends to surface are the things we have been keeping busy in order to avoid, the unresolved questions, the grief we have not finished, the desires we have been pretending not to have because they feel too dangerous to claim. The sense of being in the wrong life, quietly present underneath the busy and the functional. This is exactly why you need to go there. Not to wallow, not to be overwhelmed, but because you cannot navigate toward your real life while you are running from the knowledge of what your real life is calling you toward. The silence is where you meet yourself honestly, and meeting yourself honestly, with compassion, without the performance, without the version of you that you present to the world, is the beginning of the kind of self-knowledge that makes alignment possible. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. That verse is often quoted as a comfort passage, a reassurance for anxious people. And it is that. But there is also an imperative in it. Be still. It is a practice, not just a posture. And the knowing that follows, the deep, settled knowing of who God is and therefore who you are in relation to Him, is connected to the stillness. You cannot rush the knowing. You can only create the conditions in which it arrives. Learning to recognize the voice. People ask all the time, how do I know if it is God speaking or just my own thoughts? This question is understandable, and it deserves a serious answer. The voice of God, when it comes in the interior register of what some call intuition, prompting, or conviction, tends to have certain qualities. It is persistent. It returns. It does not need you to be worked up or emotionally heightened to be heard. It is patient. It is usually quieter than the voice of fear, which is urgent and insistent. And it aligns, consistently and coherently, with what you already know to be true from Scripture, from wisdom, and from the test. The voice of fear is loud and reactive. It tells you that there is no time, that you must decide now, that the window is closing.
The voice of your ego is concerned primarily with reputation, with how you will look, with whether you will be admired or criticized. The voice of God tends to be more interested in the question of whether you are becoming the person He made you to be than in whether you are being successful by any external measure. One practical exercise for developing this discernment is the practice of journaling in prayer. Not just writing about your day, but writing to God, telling Him honestly what you are feeling, what you are afraid of, what you want, what you cannot figure out, and then sitting in silence and writing whatever comes. You are not transcribing divine dictation. You are learning the feel of the conversation. Over time, the texture of genuine spiritual clarity becomes distinguishable from the texture of wishful thinking or anxiety-driven rationalization. It takes practice, it takes patience, and it is worth it.
Chapter 5. Faith as Action. Moving when you cannot see. The myth of perfect clarity. One of the most effective ways the enemy paralyzes people who are genuinely seeking to live in the will of God is through the demand for perfect clarity. The requirement that before they take a single step, every detail must be known, every outcome must be guaranteed, every question must be answered. And since life never provides that kind of certainty, the person remains stationary. Not because they lack faith, they would tell you, but because they are waiting on God. Sometimes waiting is right. There are seasons of preparation that look like inaction, but are actually essential. But very often, what looks like waiting on God is actually waiting on certainty. And those are two completely different things. Faith, in its most active sense, is the willingness to move with partial information. It is the willingness to take the step you can see, trusting that the next one will be visible when you need it. It is not recklessness. It is not the abandonment of wisdom or the ignoring of counsel. It is the decision to act from trust rather than from evidence. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1.
Think about what this actually means. Faith is the substance, the real, present, material weight of something that has not yet arrived in the physical realm. It is not wishing. It is not hoping in the passive sense. It is a confidence that has a texture to it, that shapes your decisions, that makes you act differently than you would if you were operating only on what you can currently see. This is a radical way to live. It runs directly counter to the risk-averse, evidence-based, statistically reasonable approach that modern culture endorses. It looks unreasonable to people who are not operating from the same foundational reality. And that is okay. Faith was never designed to be impressive to the people who do not share its foundation. The first step. There is a principle that shows up across many traditions and which experience consistently validates. Clarity rarely comes before action. It most often comes during or after. You take the first step in faith, and the first step is what makes the second step visible. You act in the direction of your calling, and the acting is what clarifies the path.
This is both terrifying and liberating. It is terrifying because it means you cannot wait for certainty before you begin. But it is liberating because it means you do not have to have everything figured out. You only have to take the step that is in front of you right now. What is the step that is in front of you? Not the entire journey, just the next step. The conversation you have been avoiding, the application you have been too afraid to submit. The investment of time in the thing that you know, in your deepest knowing, is pointing you toward your purpose. The commitment to begin before you are ready with what you have from where you are. Begin. When the path looks wrong, there will be moments, and if you are honest, you have probably already had them, when you take the step in faith and the outcome is not what you hoped. When you move toward what you believe you are called to and something goes wrong. The door closes, the relationship ends, the opportunity dissolves, the project fails. And the temptation in those moments is enormous. The temptation is to conclude that the whole thing was a mistake, that you misheard, that you were presumptuous, that you should return to the safe and the known and stop reaching. But closed doors are not always no's. Sometimes they are redirections. Sometimes they are refinements, the path correcting itself toward the destination. Sometimes the thing that felt like failure was actually the removal of what was not right for you, to make space for what is. The question to sit with when things go wrong is not simply, was this a mistake? The question is, what is this trying to teach me? What is being clarified here that I could not have seen without this experience? The path to purpose is rarely a straight line. It is full of turns and reversals and detours that look like failures, but turn out to be essential. The people who look back at their lives and see the hand of God in every piece of the story, the successes and the disasters alike, are the people who refuse to let the difficulty of the journey be the final word.
Chapter 6. The Role of Surrender. The most misunderstood word in faith. Surrender. In almost every context outside of spiritual life, this word means defeat. It means the war is over and you lost. It means giving up. And so when spiritual teachers say that surrender is necessary for purpose, many people hear give up on your dreams, stop wanting things, become passive. That is not what surrender means here. Spiritual surrender is not the abdication of desire. It is the relinquishment of control over the outcome. It is the decision to hold your vision, your hopes, and your plans with an open hand rather than a closed fist. It is the difference between saying, I will pursue this goal, and if God wills it, it will come, and saying, I will pursue this goal, and I will make it happen by any means necessary, regardless of what God might be directing me toward. The person who has surrendered is not passive. They work hard. They apply themselves with everything they have, but they have released the need to dictate the specific form the outcome must take. They have freed themselves from the exhausting position of needing to control every variable. And in that release, something interesting happens. They become available to the unexpected.
The gift of not getting what you wanted. This is one of those things that is easy to understand in the abstract and almost impossible to receive in the moment of its happening. But there are few spiritual lessons more consistently validated by human experience than this one. Sometimes what God redirects you away from was a detour that would have taken you away from your real path, disguised as an opportunity. How many people have looked back at the job they desperately wanted and did not get, and understood years later that if they had gotten it, they would never have been available for what their life was actually leading toward? How many people have looked back at the relationship that ended in devastation and understood from the vantage point of what came after that the ending was a grace? This is not to minimize grief. Loss is real. Disappointment has weight. You do not have to pretend that the door closing did not hurt in order to receive the wisdom that the closing was carrying. But the person who can hold both the grief and the trust simultaneously, who can say, this hurts, and I still believe I am held, that person is living in a dimension of faith that most people only read about. Surrender as partnership. The deepest form of surrender in the pursuit of God's will is not the surrender of your desires, but the surrender of your timeline, the surrender of your insistence on how and when the purpose must manifest. Because God, who sees the whole of the story, works across a canvas that is far larger than the one you can see from where you are standing. What looks like delay is often preparation. What looks like being passed over is often being positioned. What looks like the wrong timing is often the right timing for a version of the outcome that is more than you had imagined. Surrender is the trust that the God who put the purpose in you can be trusted with the delivery of it, even when the delivery is not according to your schedule. This is partnership. You bring your full self, your full effort, your full willingness to grow and be stretched and be changed. And you bring your open hands, releasing your grip on the specific form the outcome must take. And in that combination of commitment and release, something extraordinary becomes possible.
Chapter 7. Persistence, Setbacks, and the Refining Process.
Why the road gets hard. If you are living in alignment with purpose, if you are genuinely moving toward the life you were made for, you will encounter resistance. This is almost universal. The stories of people who stepped into significant purpose without facing significant obstacles are rare to the point of near non-existence. And the reason for this is not arbitrary cruelty from a God who enjoys watching people struggle. The reason is this. The thing you are being called to carry requires a version of you that does not yet fully exist. And the only way that version of you comes into being is through the process of being tested, refined, and stretched beyond your current capacity. The difficulty is not a sign that you have gone wrong. Very often, the difficulty is a sign that you are getting close to what you were made for. Think about any process of formation in the physical world. Steel becomes strong through heat and hammering. Diamonds are formed under extraordinary pressure. The grape becomes wine through a process that, if the grape had a say in it, it might describe as devastating. The process is inseparable from the outcome. You cannot have the result without the refining.
The courage to continue. Persistence is not glamorous. There are no highlights from the middle of a long obedience in the same direction. The moments that get told in the story are the beginning and the arrival. What is invisible in the retelling are the years in between, the seasons of showing up when you did not feel like it, the days when the evidence suggested you were fooling yourself, the moments of doubt so heavy that moving forward felt like lifting stone. Those moments are where character is built, not in the victories, in the daily, unglamorous decision to continue. And what sustains that decision, ultimately, is not willpower. Willpower is a limited resource. It runs out. What sustains it is a depth of conviction about the reality of what you are moving toward. A conviction so settled, so repeatedly reinforced by the interior witness of the Spirit, that the external circumstances cannot dislodge it. That is what Paul was describing when he wrote about having learned, in whatever state he was, to be content. Not that the circumstances were always good, but that his sense of his identity and his purpose was not dependent on the circumstances being good.
I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. Philippians 4:11. This is not learned in a single revelation. It is learned the way all deep things are learned, through repeated practice, through encounter with difficulty, through the discovery that what you thought you needed in order to be okay turned out to be less essential than you believed. Knowing when to pivot versus when to persist. One of the genuinely hard questions in the life of purpose is the question of discernment. When does persistence become stubbornness, and when does changing course become a failure of nerve? When should you keep pushing against a closed door, and when should you accept that the closed door is an answer? There is no formula for this, but there are some useful indicators. Persistence is usually warranted when the internal witness, the deep, quiet knowing in the place below your anxiety, has not changed, even as the external circumstances have become difficult. When the sense of calling has not dimmed, even as the path has become hard, that is usually a signal to continue.
Pivoting is usually warranted when the thing you are holding on to has become an idol, when you are pursuing it not from a sense of genuine calling, but from pride, from the need to prove something, or from a refusal to receive the wisdom that the difficulty is trying to offer. When the pursuit has become about winning rather than about the purpose itself, that is worth examining carefully. And sometimes, what looks like a pivot is actually an evolution. The purpose stays the same, but the form it takes changes. You were not wrong about the destination. You were just mistaken about the specific vehicle that would get you there. Chapter 8. Living in the Flow of Purpose. What alignment actually feels like. We have talked about the work, the inner clearing, the persistence, the surrender, the discernment. Now, let us talk about what it is like on the other side of that work, or rather in the midst of it,
when you begin to experience what it is to be genuinely aligned with the life you were made for. It does not always feel like triumph. It does not feel like every day is a mountaintop experience. It feels, most of the time, more like a deep current beneath the surface of your daily life. A current that is carrying you even on the days when you cannot feel it moving.
There is a quality of rightness, a sense that even when things are hard, they are hard in the right direction. A sense that the effort you are expending has weight, that it matters, that it is going somewhere, that it is connected to something larger than the immediate outcome. People who are living in alignment with purpose rarely need external validation to know they are on the right track. The work itself is generative. It feeds them, even as it demands from them. There is also, characteristically, a quality of service. People who are living deeply in their purpose are not primarily thinking about themselves. They are thinking about the people their work reaches, the lives their calling touches, the world that is different because they showed up. This other-directedness is not forced. It is the natural outcome of living in alignment with a purpose that was, by design, intended to be given away.
Your ordinary days as sacred ground. One of the most important reframings available to the person pursuing purpose is the reframing of ordinary time. Because we tend to think of purpose as something that happens in the dramatic moments, the big speech, the major breakthrough, the defining achievement. And so the ordinary days, the daily tasks, the repetitive routines, the unremarkable hours get classified as background noise, as the time between the moments that actually count. But this is a profound misunderstanding of how purpose actually works. Your ordinary days are not the interruption of your purpose. They are the substance of it. The way you show up for the ordinary conversation is practicing for the extraordinary one. The quality of attention you bring to the seemingly small task is developing the habit of excellence that will be present in the large one. The person you are becoming in the quiet of your unwitnessed moments is the person who will stand in the visible ones. Every day that you choose integrity over convenience is a day you are becoming someone who can be trusted with more. Every day that you choose generosity over scarcity is a day you are developing the character that purpose requires. Every day that you choose to show up fully, to bring your whole self to what is in front of you, regardless of its size or its audience, is a day you are building the person that the assignment is waiting for.
Do not despise the ordinary days. They are where the real work happens. Gratitude as orientation. There is one practice that is so consistently transformative for people who are trying to align their lives with purpose that it deserves its own mention before we close. And it is the practice of gratitude, not as a spiritual nicety, not as a ritual of politeness, but as a fundamental orientation toward reality. Gratitude, practiced deliberately and consistently, does something remarkable to the human heart. It retrains attention. It shifts the default focus from what is lacking to what is present. It cultivates the kind of awareness that notices the 10,000 daily evidences of grace that anxiety and striving cause us to walk past without seeing. And in the specific context of manifesting God's will, gratitude is an act of faith. It is saying, I believe that what I have been given is enough to begin with. I believe that what is present in my life right now contains the seeds of what is coming. I believe that the God who has brought me this far can be trusted with the rest. Gratitude shifts you from a posture of grasping to a posture of receiving. And it is the posture of receiving, open-handed, expectant, aware, that allows the fullness of. We have covered a great deal of ground together. We have talked about identity and the inner work of clearing. We have talked about agreement and alignment, about stillness and discernment, about the active nature of faith and the spiritual intelligence of surrender. We have talked about persistence and refining and the sacredness of ordinary days. But I want to end where we began, with the deepest truth underlying everything we have discussed. You were not an accident. The fact that you are alive right now, in this particular moment in history, with this particular collection of experiences, wounds, longings, gifts, and questions, is not a random occurrence. You are here on purpose, for a purpose. And the God who designed you is not distant, disinterested, or unaware of the specific shape of your life and all the ways it has been difficult and all the ways it has not yet become what you know it is meant to be. He is near. He is present. And he is.
The will of God for your life is not something you have to manufacture. It is something you have to align with. And alignment happens through the practices we have discussed: the inner work of identity, the cultivation of stillness, the willingness to act in faith, the discipline of persistence, the grace of surrender, the sacredness of showing up fully in your ordinary days. None of this is a formula. None of this guarantees a specific timeline or a particular form of success. But all of it, faithfully and patiently practiced, leads in the same direction, toward the person you were made to be, living the life you were made for, in service of a world that needs what only you can give. There is a life available to you that is larger than the one you are currently allowing yourself to imagine. There is a version of your story that has not yet been written, a chapter that begins the moment you decide to believe, at the level where the real decisions are made, that God's word about you is more true than anything else that has ever been said about you.
That chapter begins now, not when you are ready, not when you have it all figured out, not when the fear is gone or the path is clear or the circumstances align. Now, with what you have, from where you are, in the ordinary, unremarkable, sacred Wednesday afternoon of your life, you have everything you need to begin. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Philippians 1:6. Go. Be who you were made to be.